Welcome to Behind the Binary, the podcast that introduces you to the fascinating people, technology, and tools driving the world of reverse engineering. I'm your host, Josh Stroschein, a reverse engineer at the Flare team at Google. Ever wonder who names the world's most notorious APTs? In this episode, we sit down with Greg Sinclair, a reverse engineer from the Flare team at Google. Greg not only hunts down sophisticated malware, but also shares the behind-the-scenes story of how he discovered and named the North Korean APT, the Lazarus Group. He also discusses his innovative methods for identifying malware families through binary similarities. Get ready for an inside look at the challenges, triumphs, and the sheer passion that defines a cutting-edge reverse engineer. It's an episode you won't want to miss. Let's dive right into my conversation with Greg Sinclair. All right. Welcome, Greg, to the podcast. It's a real privilege and honor to have you here. This is something I know we've been trying to mesh our schedules now for quite some time. Greg, why don't we start just with a little bit more about who you are and your background and what makes you tick? What is it about reverse engineering that has caught your attention over all these years? Because as far as I understand, you've been reversing for quite a while now.
Yeah. I guess, honestly, even before I started reversing, I've always had an interest in how things work. Even since I was a little kid, my parents were so frustrated because I would get toys and then eventually take them apart. And I was great taking them apart. Putting them back together wasn't always my thing. Once I figured out how something worked, I kind of lost interest. So I moved on to the next toy to take apart, and it became a whole thing. To this day, there's a story I tell people all the time, but my sister, to this day, 35, 40 years, I guess 40 years later, wow, is still mad that I took apart her glowworm, which just basically a little, for those who are too young to know what glowworm is, it's basically a little worm. You squeeze it and its little face lights up because it's basically just a flashlight. So even as a kid, I was just taking things apart. As I got older, that taking things apart turned into trying to figure out how programs worked. I started out first programming when I was in middle school, high school, and then when I got to college, I started working on particular projects that I was like, I'm curious how this program works, because it wasn't. That's way before open source was a thing. Nowadays half programs are open source. You can look at the code. But back then you didn't have that option. So I would take things apart, figure out how to read the file structure, figure out how to, take the instructions, make them basically make sense, figure out how it flowed. The first project I really worked on when I was working at a place called Strayer, we had these cameras this is back before you had IP cameras, but this is one of the first early ones. It was by actually D-Link, I believe it was back in the day. And I wanted to use them for security in one of our buildings, but no one really trusted the idea yet of having a network camera. So I was like, all right, well, I'll take apart the firmware to figure out what it's doing, make sure it's not, sharing information that it shouldn't be sharing, etc. So that's kind of the first project that I really started working on.
So it's safe to say that your curiosity got you into reversing, but maybe your first, it sounds like maybe your first job wasn't necessarily a reverse engineering role.
No, at the time, I was working, I was what was my title? Head of IT security for Strayer University.
Okay.
So I was actually their security team, basically their entire security team. And this was like the early 2000s. So, security was kind of a thing that was just coming about. My first job was, running the library at Strayer, at one of the Strayer campuses. And then I managed to convince them that security was important. And that's how I got the job at corporate. My first job was doing security. And then from there, I started using my reverse engineering skills to kind of test, make sure that some of the stuff that we were doing made sense, that, that we're to prove that particular pieces of firmware were not exposing information that they shouldn't be, which actually led to my next job, where I worked for a healthcare company, or a healthcare insurance company. And I became I got a job as on their red team. So we were taking apart things like that's my first professional reverse engineering job. I was taking apart uh, and trying to break into projects that we had there. One of my favorite things from that job, we were trying to do an assessment on this portal that would be used by higher ups, the board of directors and whatnot, to uh, basically share documents that were highly sensitive. So we need to make sure that the portal itself was fine, and it was running. It was running off of this well-known platform at the time. I'd rather not say, just in case they're still mad about it. Um,
Okay.
we had a bit of a run in it with this company. Anyway, it was a reverse proxy, and it was all very tight, button down, closed source, everything. But they did have the ability for you could download an ISO to upgrade the firmware or the operating system on the actual physical devices. It was all encrypted, and so we were we were trying to figure out how to get around that because we didn't have access to the devices that were in production because they're very expensive and they didn't want to share. Fair enough. Um, but we'd done a previous assessment on a different piece of hardware of theirs, and we found a vulnerability that let us basically pull files off of the file system through their web interface. It was an oversight that we reported and they got fixed. But one of the things that we downloaded off the system was the upgrade tool. And that was honestly one of the larger challenges I've ever had with reverse engineering. Admittedly, it was earlier in my career, so hopefully it wouldn't be as big a challenge now, but it used something called chicken, which is, if probably no one's ever heard of it, but if you've ever heard of Scheme or Lisp, the language with all the parentheses, um, it basically takes that and converts it into C that is compilable, and then you compile that. Well, the problem is, whereas a normal C function has a return, this had what was called continuous closure, if I remember the term correctly, which basically meant it just kind of bled into the next instruction, into the next instruction, and the next instruction, and so forth. So for every one or two operations, it would then either branch or bleed into another function, which had its own header and own frame and everything. It was a whole thing. So I ended up having to create. I ended up having to create my own kind of method for doing that. It turned it into more of a graphical way of doing things. So I ended up graphically reconstructing what the Lisp code was on the back end to figure out what the code was actually doing. And from that, I was able to reconstruct the decryption algorithm for the ISOs. So from there, we were able to create virtual machines of the things that we were testing and have greater access to see what our different attacks were doing behind the scenes. And from that, we were able to prove that perhaps they needed to tighten up a couple more things before they released this portal out to the board of directors and the VPs and whatnot. So that was actually a really cool project.
Yeah, that certainly sounds like it. Kind of fraught with all of the typical challenges that reverse engineers have. That is, you know, not no access to source code, of course. Getting past obfuscation, encryption might have been the primary. Was that the primary layer then that they were using to like hide their intellectual property in the code once you got past that encryption, or did you see other types of anti-analysis?
It's basically just that. And they made the assumption that you weren't going to be able to get to the hard drive, that you weren't going to be able to see the contents of the machine when it was running. So once you snapped off the encryption part of it, you essentially had a file image, a Linux file image disk image that you could simply just load up, and you were good to go.
Interesting. Yeah. What did you find? At the time, I guess it kind of going back and then to this point, learning reverse engineering is. Did you find it to be kind of a very solo endeavor? I mean, even working on a project such as this, usually the the RE teams are quite small within organizations. Go back 20 years or so ago, I would imagine that the skill set was even, you know, fewer and far between. Was that the experience you had?
I would say yes. The team that we had there, let's see, we had uh, about 5 or 6 REs, of various levels of experience, but most of them were doing it professionally for a while. I learned a lot from that team. Actually, they were one of the guys that I worked with, a guy named Michael Lai, super smart dude. Um, and him and another guy named Dave Glady taught me a lot. Just a lot of different techniques that I still use to this very day. Um, but at the end of the day, when you're working on a particular project, odds are you're doing it by yourself. I mean, you'll have a team to work with, and ask questions of. But at the end of the day, it's you and a copy of IDA. You're sitting at a screen until you run into a problem and have to ask somebody. But for the most part, yeah, it's a relatively solitary operation, which is fine. It actually works out really well, because it gives you the chance to work at your own pace, to kind of dive into areas that are really of interest to you. And that's kind of one of my major problems in general is, when I'm reverse engineering something, there's this itch that I just have to scratch, and that is trying to figure out how everything works. I'm always afraid that I am going to miss something critical. So if the question is just tell us, let me back up a minute. When we get a ticket, um, well, generally comes with questions like that they won't answer. It's more often than not, hey, here's a sample. Tell me about it. It's more like, here's a sample that we have. Tell us the IOCs, or tell us what, if it's ransomware, like what algorithm does it use, et cetera, et cetera. So, which is more focused, which is fine. I mean, people have questions, and we're here to answer questions. But for me, I need to know how the whole thing works, and so I end up putting a lot more time to almost reconstruct things back to source. I'll put time into reconstructing structures that are that the original code had to kind of make sense of what's being passed around. I will clean up the decompiled source as much as possible. Again, it's a bit more overkill than probably necessary, but I'm always afraid I'm going to miss something. Which there's good sides about that and bad sides about that. The bad side is it takes longer for me to get through a sample, but the good side is that I can tell you, you ask me any question about it, I will have an answer for you, even if you didn't think to ask it the first time. And that actually comes from some of my time working at, when I was at iDefense, uh, but at that point used to be part of, VeriSign. I think now they're part of Accenture, maybe, I don't know. Excuse me. And so there's this one project I was working on. We found this botnet, and I was analyzing it, and I was pretty sure I had an idea of how we could stop it. This is one of the first times that I got into the realm of disruptions for malicious actors, and I was super excited. I was like, "Oh, we can take this botnet down. There's a certain counter in here that if we just overflow it, um, we can just inject into the botnet and overflow this counter. It'll essentially cripple them." And I was very excited. I was ready to go ahead and do it. And then I realized I was looking at an integer as a signed integer, and it was an unsigned integer, which meant the value I would have put in there wouldn't really done much. It would have just, it would have made a big number, but not the number that would have crippled the botnet. So again, that's one of the reasons to the point now I get really particular about making sure I know all the details. And don't get me wrong, I'm not perfect. I still miss things left, right, and center like everyone else does. But I do really want to find out all the details, because once I figure out the details of a piece of code, uh, I'm ready to move on to the next one. Because now I've solved the puzzle, and that's what reverse engineering is to me. It's solving a puzzle. And that's actually a lot of fun. The puzzle part of this, I think, is what really motivates more things. Just figuring out how the thing works.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a really I think, to me, that's a big challenge with the reversing too. Is you look at any piece of complex software that does anything within, the Windows operating system, for example. You add in layers of obfuscation and anti-analysis and other misdirection, add some libraries or other code, and it's usually a big puzzle. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it's really hard to have the time and to know like exactly what routes to go down, and not to go down those proverbial rabbit holes, and balance that. I need to provide answers with, I've only got so much time. Is there like generally a way you help, balance that, or keep yourself, you know, moving in the right direction? Do you have techniques or something that you can leverage to do that, or do you just start reversing and just see where it takes you?
I would say most of the time I start out in kind of a linear fashion. So I will start out in the way that the operating system is going to run the program that I'm looking at. Start out at the entry point and then work down through each one of the branches to try to figure out what's going on. Uh, the downside to that is you can get lost in the minutia early on. And that's one of the things that's really good about IDA, especially when you're dealing with Windows binaries that are written using like Visual Studio or even GCC, or Shelang and all that kind of stuff, is that there are type libraries that will tell you, hey, you're walking into a library function. You can probably stop here. Don't you don't need to reverse engineer stir copy. We can tell you to stir copy and we'll move forward. Um, so that kind of stuff really comes in handy. But then you run into other problems where you don't have that kind of information, and you can really go down a rabbit hole. For me, the kind of the I need to go back moment is when I start seeing a ton of functions that have very little input. They're just like calling function after function after function after function after function, and it's just like a just deep dive. And I'm like, okay, I don't. There's something going on here. I have probably hit a library of some sort. I'm going to go back, put a marker that says, hey, not sure what's going on here. I'll come back to it later and see if there's any other information. Um, Another thing that really, for me, is a kind of a red flag when I'm just starting out is if I see a bunch of pointers, or if I see it accessing memory that just suddenly popped up, like it's suddenly now accessing, it's making a decision based on this particular D word that I haven't seen accessed anywhere else, and then I'll go look at the XREFs and say, okay, well, who's modifying this? And if there's no direct modification to it, that means it's probably part of a structure, which means I need to figure out where that structure comes from. So I'm like, okay, we'll put a pin here, come back to it. Let's go back up a little more so we see what we can figure out. So I try to high level, if I can use that term, probably kind of high level the overview of what's the overall structure of the code, and then go back and fill in the details as I can. But yeah, so basically, if I start feeling like I'm hitting a library, or if the worst thing you can do is you can open up a function and see a ton of XORs and shifts, and I'm like, okay, well, now we're in crypto, so we're going to back out of this real quick.
Yep.
Yeah, that crypto and compression in a normal binary are the worst things to run into, in my opinion.
Yeah, I use the cross reference graph, I think, in a similar fashion, in that if I pick any point, any function that I'm currently at, and I'm kind of curious what it devolves into, I'll look at a cross reference graph, and if IDA takes more than 5 seconds to generate that graph, I know I'm probably in bad territory, and it's time to back up or put a pin on it and come back to it later. Or sometimes I've had varying luck with just throwing decompiled code into LLMs like Gemini, and getting some pretty good results. Where maybe IDA's flirt hasn't quite got caught up. Sometimes these things can help. LLMs can help with that. So, and and some of the, I don't know. This sounds like I have another commonality in that I do have this tendency to get bored with things quickly. When I set out to accomplish a goal and a perceived challenge, and then once I get there, I'm like, okay, I'm ready to move on to the next thing. And sometimes I struggle with that with reversing too, even if I have some sample that I've given very directed, go figure this out, or making it for some educational content. Once I hit that spot, I kind of lose interest in continuing the process. And so I have to be kind of careful because oftentimes there are more questions and more paths to follow. But I guess that also to me has been kind of an indicator that maybe I've done the work that I've needed, and it's time to move on. But anyways, just an observation. It can certainly be a professional challenge that I encounter as well.
Oh yeah, understood.
Yeah. So a lot of the work, some of the stories you're describing, a lot of times the reversing effort is behind the scenes. It's something that supports a team. It's usually very sensitive in nature because it's part of, I don't know, disrupting botnets or trying to track and disrupt threat actors in a stealthy way that they don't know that you're tracking them. And so it's not all that often that the real story of the work comes to national global headlines. One area where that has been true for you is with the Lazarus Group. So can you, hopefully everyone's familiar with them, and if not, can you give us maybe a little bit of background about who they are and and how you came across them and maybe where the name came from? I'm also quite curious about that as well.
Sure. So for those who aren't aware, Lazarus Group is a name associated with the North Korean APT group. They've been around for longer than most people realize. Trying to remember off the top of my head. I think the earliest ones we found was like 2007. They've been doing their thing for a while. And the way I got involved in all this was it was back during the Sony Pictures attack. Sony was going to release a movie that was considered, I'm not sure the right term, let's just say bad for North Korea. Made them look bad. And they didn't appreciate that. So they ended up wiping a ton of Sony Pictures infrastructure, leaking a bunch of information from Sony Pictures. It was a bad day for Sony. They didn't have a good day.
They released the movie too, didn't they?
They ultimately released the movie, yes.
Yeah. But did they leak it, or did Sony actually release the movie?
Sony actually released it, as far as
Sony released it.
Yeah, because they didn't want the movie released at all. So they were mad about the movie, and then that's why they attacked the Sony Pictures, or Sony Pictures Entertainment, I think it's the official name. But yeah, they wiped a lot of their machines. Well, I just come off an operation called SMN, where we went after a Chinese APT group, released a document, worked with a bunch of people. It was really a cool project, and we're looking for something else to do. At this point I was at a company called Novetta, working with some good friends of mine, and then the Sony Pictures attacks happened. And I was like, okay, we got to go after this. And so I was talking with my buddies. One of who was my boss. He's like, oh yeah, it's a great target. Let's go after him. And the FBI had released 3, 4, or 5. I can't remember which. Somewhere around there. We'll go with 4. Split the middle. Hashes that were related to the attack. So of course we went to VirusTotal, grabbed those, grabbed a copy of those, and I started taking them apart. And one of the things that I guess specialize in, lack of a better term, is I like to find all the members of a malware family that I can, like all versions. Something I enjoy. So I started taking reverse engineering these, found pieces of code that I thought were particularly unique. One of the things, as you know, is if you do this long enough, you can start figuring out what kind of like almost signatures or fingerprints of different actors, because they'll, the ones who really know what they're doing will do code in a certain way, and so you can kind of hone in on that. And so what I did was I went and found some of those pieces, and then did what are called retro hunts. For those who aren't familiar with retro hunt, is basically you take a YAR signature, which is a way of finding bytes or strings or different patterns inside files. You put it into VirusTotal and tell VirusTotal, hey, I need to find all the samples that match this, and it'll go back, I think, about a year. And from there, I also started pulling down more samples, and I reverse engineer those samples. And then I would look for unique chunks of code in there, write more signatures, do more retro hunts. So it became an iterative process of find sample, find signature, retro hunt, rinse and repeat. Um, and from that, I ended up turning those 4 or 5 samples that I was given into 50 different families of malware. Um, there were a whole bunch of different things. They had destructive tools. They had rats. I think even had like a peer-to-peer network at one point, which is really kind of cool. A couple of samples from that. So, they kept reusing the code, different parts, and from that, that code reuse, I was able to just keep tracking them back further and further in time. One of the advantages, even though you only have like a year of 365 days, this is the maximum amount of time that RetroHunt will scan. Things get re-uploaded all the time, so even in that year, I was still catching things that were much older, which is great. I love it. I'm a huge fan of VirusTotal. Always have been. But anyway, so that reuse of code is where Lazarus came from. So people are like, oh, like Lazarus from the Bible. And that was the story that my boss was cool with me telling people. But the actual story is Lazarus Pit from Batman. For those who aren't familiar with Batman lore, there was this thing called Lazarus Pit. This one villain would go into it, rejuvenate himself, come out younger and stronger. That's basically how I kept viewing their code. They would go in, they would reuse parts of their code, make a new tool to do a new thing, and come out a little bit stronger from their things. So that's where the name came from. So it's basically a Batman reference. But yeah, the code that they produced was surprisingly high quality. I mean, everybody hears about North Korea being a very insular country, and you're thinking, they being told they don't have any real access to the internet, which is probably true for the majority of people, but the people on these teams clearly had access to the internet at large because they were writing really good code. And I'm not trying to praise a bad actor, but I will give their developers credit where credit is due.
Did that suggest to you that it was like a disciplined team of these tool developers that had good coding practices and all, access to internet and good training and good standards, or maybe just a handful, a very small group of people that were just the ones responsible for writing all the code? I've worked on software development teams. I know how hard it is to get a group of people to consistently write similar style code.
Yeah, honestly, I don't have anything to back it up one way or the other, but my gut is it was a smaller team that was, like I said, a disciplined team that knew what they were doing. They were trained, they were professional, and they knew how to write good code. And some pretty creative code as well. So yeah, again, not trying to praise a bad actor, but I will give credit to their development team. They did a nice job.
Yeah. What was their? I guess it's the Sony hacks, and we're talking like 2014, right? Because I know Sony's been involved with a number of different incidents over the years.
Yeah, it was I believe late 2014, around November-ish.
Late 2014. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's been 15 years. I mean, I'm sorry, it's been 10 years, so the numbers are getting a little fuzzy in my head. But I think if you remember, it was like late 2014 because I remember it being winter when we had the conversation about what we were going to go after.
Was a lot of their tooling like C? Could you tell what they were developing in?
Yeah, it was basically C. I don't even think there was C++ involved in that. I think it was largely just C.
Okay.
Yeah. But this is one of those times where I mentioned libraries earlier. It was great since they kept reusing their code over and over and over again. I could just basically say, oh, this is function XYZ. This is before you had like Lumina and whatnot. So my solution to keeping me from having to redo a bunch of unnecessary reversing was I would create what I typically refer to as a quote golden IDB. That's where I've taken a sample and I have gone all the way through. I have cleaned up everything. I have prototyped all the functions. I have created all the structures that I need. You could essentially tell IDA to decompile it in full and probably probably recompile it straight. I put a lot of work into those. But then once I start seeing, once I see something that looks similar, I'll take one of the golden IDBs that I created, bin diff it, and then just import all the functions that I need. So effectively that was my DIY Lumina solution for back in the day.
Oh, okay.
And so it made reversing a whole lot easier because I can just skip huge chunks of code and focus on what was new.
Well, someday I think we're going to have our own spot in the Smithsonian for reversing, and there's going to be IDA Pro control flow graph art. And I think we should now add golden IDBs that somehow will be on display. So hang on to those.
No, definitely.
don't let those go, and make sure that you have a whole chain of custody so they don't disappear, because I think it'd be interesting to have these as a resource, because I don't know how many times I've cracked open IDA, spent a fair amount of time, not usually to the extent that you're describing, but a fair amount of time cleaning things up, renaming, and you're really proud with it. And I can't I don't have anyone to share this with. It might facilitate my work, but hey kids, come in here. Look what Dad did today. I got this really cool IDB. They wouldn't know what they were looking at. Okay. That's really cool. So how did the name stick? So you took those samples, you expanded the work, but that's the name they're known by. Like how did you go from just having this idea and starting to do this work to becoming, the person or the team that named the APT? That's, I mean, as far as I know, that persists as a way to refer to the North Korean APT to this day.
Oh yeah, I smile every time I see it. I won't lie. So when we had this, we put a good year of effort into this. I was the sole reverse engineer. We had a data analyst, working with us. We had an Intel analyst working with us, and then my manager, who has a ton of contacts in the security community. And so it wasn't, at the end of the day, we didn't want it to be just us. Cause we're this random company in Northern Virginia, that I guarantee you today, people probably still don't know who they are, which is fine. So my manager had the philosophy of, sunlight and bleach. So everything that we learned, all the samples that I created, all of the signatures that I created, we wanted to expose those to others in the community, both in the private side and in the government side. And we also wanted to package it in a way that people would understand and people would be interested in learning more about. So this is the first time I've ever worked with a PR company, which was an interesting experience in and of itself. So anytime you see like a really flashy report coming out, if there's a PR company involved, there's a lot of work behind the scenes to do that. Like there's a lot of, here, what do you think about this graphic here versus like, what about this one? And what if we put this kind of graph in? What if we put in, this kind of text? This use just font. It's a lot of minutia. So we ended up getting a PR company involved. We worked during that year. We also worked with various private companies. We did have some agencies that we reached out to and were involved with. It was a lot of people. And so it was, at the end, we released everything. And we had a really flashy report. When I don't say flashy, it was really well done. And I don't know, I'm trying to think. I'm trying to remember back. Sorry, it's been like 10 years. When we released it, we had a full media push. I think our CEO even like came out and a couple different um, like articles, press junket kind of things, and so it was really cool. And as a result, in that report, to answer your question, sorry, I'm really going around about here, and to in that report, we refer to them as the Lazarus Group, and so being the first one to kind of call out all of this detail, the name just kind of stuck.
Sure. I suppose that probably easier to refer to them as that, a little bit more catchy, and I would imagine making marketing material might have made that a little bit easier too. And if I remember correctly, I'm looking it up here as we talk. Mandiant's APT1 came out February of 2013, it looks like. And that, I don't know, again, maybe I'm wrong. My recollection is a bit fuzzy, but that seemed like the first of its kind to start kind of exposing this sort of nation state level activity and kind of wrapping it up in a package that folks could, be more interested and engaged with what you're releasing, and tracking that and utilizing it to help better, secure their environments and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of the like my boss would say at the time, the whole sunlight and bleach approach. If you're going to disrupt somebody, exposing everything they're doing as much as you can, giving signatures to detect everything they're doing, forces them to retool. And when they're retooling, they're not as active, and so you've slowed them down. And if you're really good, if you're really lucky, you can cripple them. But if you're dealing with a nation state, they're just going to retool. Let's be honest. That they have the financial resources just to retool. There, of course, is the argument that we have all the time of, okay, once I go off and release all this information, and I've exposed their operation, I will lose that signal because they will have to retool, which means we'll have to find them again. And during that process, while we're trying to find them, they could be doing things that we don't know about. If we track them for a long period of time and don't disrupt, then yes, we can keep an eye on what they're doing. So there's the argument of when is it worth losing the signal to protect something? And I don't have a good answer for that. That is a question that required a lot of discussion. Have you ever run into a problem with that before?
Well, I mean, this is the space that comes up the most often for me. So no, I can't say off the top of my head I have.
Yeah, I've run into it a couple different times. Like I said, we did this operation. So the first one we did before this, like I said, it was Operation SMN, where we were going after China, and we didn't do the full report, the full press package, and we were able to influence a bunch of AV vendors to look for certain things and take care of it. But I mean, it didn't make nearly the impact, so it wasn't as big. Like I said, as big a splash. I don't think we did as much disruption as we did with North Korea. The best part about North Korea, by the way, in my opinion, with all of this, is a few months, like just a few months afterwards, that was when the Bangladeshi bank heist that they tried to do happened. So part of it was they were able to detect the signal from what we released to after the fact to be like to do attribution. So they didn't give up easy. You got to give them, again, not trying to praise the actor, but you got to give them credit. They kept on going. They kept on trying.
Yeah. Yeah. I came from 10 years of academia, and that's when I first really got into reversing that, and then doing some consulting. And a lot of my reversing work has been more on the research end. I even to this day haven't had an opportunity to really get out there and track. I mean, I think part of the interesting aspect of this work is that you don't have to work for a big company to do it. When Emotet was going full steam, there was a collaborative group of people that were, outside of their day jobs, researching, tracking, hunting, exposing, and I was I was an informal. I felt like I was an informal small part of that, never an official part of the group, and I probably never really contributed a whole lot. But the name of the game there, I think, was volume against volume. The Ematech group was just so prolific, that getting IOCs out as fast as possible was the response there, just to help all of the potential victims across the globe. So I guess that's the only sort of indirect involvement I've had in something like that.
Emotet was brutal, with how quickly they would update their infrastructure, and the way they did it. I mean, they would put it. They would just keep sending out updated versions of their binary, every 12 hours almost at different points. And so to get those out, you had to reverse engineer the obfuscator, because he had a different obfuscator every time, to get that out of the binary. So you'd break the obfuscator, then go in and find the IPs they were using. It was a mess. I ended up creating a tool for that. Actually, that was fun. I set it up. I used what is it, VirtualBox? I would, whenever a new one would come down, I put it in VirtualBox. I have a script. I would put it in VirtualBox, run it up to a certain number of seconds, and then use a YARS signature to go in and figure out where the memory was, and then extract that using a Python script. That was the only way I could remotely keep up with them. Yeah, they were brutal.
Yeah, because they basically had a config for their IPs, didn't they?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like a list,
or their C2 or something. Yeah,
like 50 IPs and ports. Yeah, it was.
Yeah, it was. They were another one. I don't like to praise bad guys, but you have to sometimes give credit where credit's due to people that are, folks that are wielding the art well. I mean, when you think about what they're doing the opposite of all of normal software development, and that is challenging. They're using infrastructure that is ill-gotten or has to be, I guess the term bulletproof, constantly trying to avoid detection, in which you have this billion dollar industry trying to come after you. I mean, it is something to study, just to see how it all comes together. And it wasn't just the binaries. I ended up at that point, it was earlier in my reversing journey. It was easier for me at the time, just being an academic and not having access to any sort of group team that was tracking them, to get the malicious documents. And even those, I mean, the layers of which they were distributing, and then the malicious documents would always have 6, 8, 12, 15 different compromised hosts that they were pulling payloads down. So then you have to think, well, gosh, how did they compromise all of this infrastructure out there, so that they could abuse somebody else's website or server for a bit of time? I'd eventually find some of the proxy scripts that, rare occasions, I could maybe get a copy of because of an open directory or something. And it's a lot. It was a lot of code out there, a lot of obfuscation. And as you said, just how quickly they were able to redeploy everything and update everything. It was something else. I'd really like to see what we really know through law enforcement about all of their infrastructure and their development. And I know some stuff has been released post arrest, but I don't know. Maybe I just haven't read enough of it to get the full scope or picture of it.
It's interesting. That's one of the things I've always enjoyed, is when you can see behind the curtain of like what they're doing, to kind of see how they're maintaining these massive malicious infrastructures. Actually, if I can sidetrack for just a minute, back when I was in iDefense, if you've ever heard of a botnet called Wallodec, they, for some reason, they got my attention just because of the way they would do their communication. It was like multi-tiered, and like there was this one tier they had like 5 different servers that commands were coming down from, and we're all like, we're like pretty sure that was a proxy, but we didn't know what was behind it. And so I spent a lot of time messing with that one just because it was fun. And I found a vulnerability in their infrastructure that let me send blind requests, HTTP requests to it, and I could start enumerating the file system underneath. So if I got like a 403, that meant, I'd hit a directory. If I hit a 404, obviously whatever I was trying to grab didn't exist. But then occasionally I started figuring out patterns, and I was able to pull down their entire address book for all their spams that they were sending out. It was great. But to your point about malicious actors trying to avoid being caught by these billion-dollar companies, right? This community. When I was doing this, I was younger. I was dumb. I ended up saying I changed the user agent on my request to be like, "Hey, this is," and I gave them my email address. If you want me to stop, just let me know. Trying to see if I can engage them to communicate with me, and they did. And so they sent me what was an early version of a Google translated email, and the question came up in their email. The one email I was allowed to interact with, because once my company realized I'd engaged with malicious actors, they asked me to stop. Fair enough.
Yeah, fair enough.
But the question came up, and they go, what level do we need to be at to be ignored? Like what can we do to be ignored by your company and other companies, and so we can keep doing our thing, but we're not making enough noise to bother anybody else. So I thought that was a really interesting question, and that was like, that's been like 17, 18 years ago now. And I still think about it, like they're at least that particular group was aware of the fact that if you make enough noise, you get enough attention, and then you become the problem. But if you can stay below that threshold, you can keep doing your thing, still keep making whatever malicious, activity you want to, make whatever ill-gotten gains, as long as you can stay below a certain level.
Yeah, that is really interesting. That wouldn't have been the response if you made me guess. That wouldn't have been the response that I would have expected you to say. And I would imagine. I don't stop and think about that very often, because we're just kind of dealing with discovery and analysis and trying to disrupt or release IOCs. And I would imagine a lot of those groups at some point have to say that. They have to make that determination. Do we operate below that radar as close to it as we can, or do we go full Emotet or others where we just as loud and obnoxious as we can to make as much money as we can as long as we can? I don't know. It'd be interesting discussions to hear behind the scenes there, to back to your earlier comment about knowing what's going on, the whole human psychology and what motivates folks to do, to get into this line of work.
It's interesting. Oh, I should also point out that in that same email, they threatened me with, "Hey, we know who you are. You don't know who we are." And I was like, okay. And that's the point where the conversation took a turn.
Yeah, that's a little more along the lines, I think, of what I was expecting, and a little dark. And
Yeah.
You have to realize, I suppose, that you're likely working with criminal elements. Well, you are working with criminal elements, maybe organized criminal, and who knows the kind of power and reach they have. So there's also, of course, for this line of work, there is operational security, and there is a level of anonymity that we all want to keep to some degree because of what you're describing there. And so, I guess with being a part of so many of these what became public research efforts, public campaigns, a nation state like North Korea, did you have any hesitations or doubts or concerns being directly associated with that?
We didn't put our names on the report. We put Nevada.
Oh, okay.
for that reason.
Yeah. Okay.
My boss at the time, he had done a lot of .gov work, and as such, he's like, "We don't want to put our names on this." And I'm like, "I'm cool with that." I don't want to find a sticky bomb under my car. That'd be great. Thanks. So yeah, no, I mean, it's been 10 years. I figure at this point, if they're still mad, they're probably over it. But yeah, no, we purposely didn't put our individual names on this report because we didn't know what we were walking into. There's a lot of mystique, I guess, around North Korea and what they're capable of. So we didn't want to be part of that lore in the
Yeah.
bad way.
Yeah, yeah, understandable. And I suppose that's a good. I should have could have made that assumption that you didn't release specific names initially, and it's now only all these years later that you're comfortable with the time having passed that you're comfortable coming out and saying, yeah, that was me.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
um,
Internally in the community, people knew who we were, but
yeah.
external to that, um, yeah, we try to keep that kind of. We put a big company big company logo in front of us so that we were a little bit more anonymous.
Okay, so I guess another area that I know you've recently done a lot of research, and this goes back to your expertise, your superpower in identifying and your desire to be exhaustive. You released a ton of signatures for Cobalt Strike, and Cobalt Strike is one of those red team tools that also get heavily abused. So it sits in this sort of weird world, I suppose, of legitimate, illegitimate usage. Uh, can you tell us a little bit about that operation? How did you go about detecting all of these samples, and what were you hoping to get as the ultimate impact of releasing such a comprehensive suite of, I think, Yara rules, right? Yara rules that are out on GitHub in order to help detect Cobalt Strike and major components of its framework.
Um, so all that kind of started because I was on a different team. Team you and I were on actually, uppercase, and we were seeing a lot of hits for the Cobalt Strike beacon. And after a while, I got kind of annoyed of constantly being like, okay, what does this beacon do? Like, what does this one do? I'm like, all right, well, let's step back for a minute and figure out if we can see what we're dealing with.
I
Um,
think somebody mentioned at one point in time that all roads lead to Beacon.
yeah,
So yeah, I could imagine the frustration and the fatigue of dealing with it all the time.
yeah, but it's popular. It's popular. Um, so I wanted to kind of see, going back to the to my friend's comment about sunlight and bleach. I wanted to make it less useful because at the time it was available. There were cracked versions of it, everywhere you looked. As such, malicious actors could stay largely unattributable by using the tool because it was generic. Um, and so, as such, they used it a lot. So what I did was kind of the same thing. I start out with finding the initial. I get a foothold somewhere. I get a sample, and then I try to figure out all the other versions based on that. By iterative Yara generation and retro hunting. Uh, Now, that being said, this one was a little different because the beacon is actually part of the overall, as part of the tool. It doesn't really get, it's not like it's getting recompiled each time. Every new version of Cobalt Strike, the suite of, there's, possibly a new version in there. So I needed to go and find all of those versions of Cobalt Strike, the suite, which comes in a jar file. So it's just a Java tool, which has a bunch of embeds in there, Beacon being one of them. So I did a lot of retro hunting to find the actual jar file. And once I had collected all of those, and I was able to go way back. It was great. They were consistent enough in how they were building these things generation after generation after generation that the tools were letting me get further and further back. And I ended up finding their change log, which is something it's on their website because it's a commercial product. It is a commercial product. So they had a change log, and I was able to find out which ones I was missing. And I think I only missed maybe 3 or 4 of the subversions that they had. And so, yeah, it was great. It was just kept going back. And then from there, then I would extract the beacon component out of each one of those jar files. And then again, using the whole golden IDB idea, I would go through and start, figuring out what I was looking at, what changed, what was new, writing signatures for each version that I found. And the idea being that at the end of it, I released a set so that anybody could just run this against whatever sample they may find And it would tell them not only that it was Beacon, but what version of Beacon it was. And that was the whole idea. It was to give it to people so they could integrate every single one of these signatures that I found into whatever tool they had. If they had, if you're an AV company, here, take it. It's yours. Go integrate it into your in your definitions so you can alert people. Because I wanted to make it as difficult as possible for actors to use all these stolen versions. And just for the record, I wasn't trying to in any way cripple the company that makes this tool. I mean, it's got it has a legitimate purpose, and my goal wasn't to damage an existing company. We actually engaged with them, let them know, hey, here's what we have, and they were like, oh, cool. Well, it gives them a chance to kind of clean up the bad that's out there, and they can keep moving forward with what they have. So it basically, if you wanted to use Cobalt Strike from that point on, the idea being that, well, all the old ones don't work, so you need to go to the company and they can give you they'll sell you the new one. And they have if I remember correctly, they have a pretty robust like vetting process. So they really try to make sure it doesn't get into the hands of bad actors. I mean, it happens. But that's just the nature of the internet, really. But no, they really did try. They really do try to keep it, for legitimate purposes. So it worked out well, I think. We were able to help clean up and expose a bunch of Beacon infrastructure just by simply saying, here, if you see this, you've got Beacon, clean it, make it go away. And then as such, it became hopefully less popular.
Any surprises in what you discovered while going through these different versions and things I always wonder, the threat actors that are using cracked software, how do they know that the software they're using, where did they get it? And was it a backdoor thing that's a backdoor that's been backdoored kind of a thing? So I'm just curious if you ran across anything that was interesting like that when you were looking at all of these cracked versions.
I don't remember too many of those. I do remember one thing that I didn't notice more often than not, that most of the cracked versions were a good major version behind. So like if the current version was version 4 or whatever, most of the cracks were version 3. And then I do remember seeing as it went on, they were trying, the company appeared to be trying to circumvent how they were being circumvented, their licensing, whatnot. So they were trying different techniques to make it more difficult for cracked versions to exist. Thought that was kind of neat. So you could kind of see the cat and mouse game there in the code itself, which was pretty cool.
How do you think an effort like this? So you put this time in, and I mean you cover a broad range of versions, it looks like, but this is still an active product with a company that's making money and they're still producing it. So how does an effort like this continue to move forward without someone like you doing this kind of work?
Well, that's one of the reasons I open sourced it, was hoping that other people could pick it up and keep going with it. I was very fortunate to have a manager and leadership team on that team who were willing to give me the time to go make this happen. That is a big ask of any organization, to be like, hey, can I go spend a couple of months doing just this one thing? And so I knew at the end of it, I wasn't going to have time to keep updating it. So releasing it out to the wild gave others the chance to say, okay, I see what he's done here. Let's go see if we can, the next version comes out, maybe someone can take that, because they're incremental changes. It's not like they're going to be huge jumps going forward. To hopefully, in their own way, pick it up and keep going forward with it. And that's kind of a problem whenever you release any signature, in my opinion, is unless you've got a team or at least a single person who is going to constantly keep updating it, they will go stale. That's also in my opinion, one of the reasons that you don't still have signatures from 10 years ago and virus definitions nowadays. Yes, admittedly, the threat's probably gone, but it'll still pop up occasionally, but there's no one there monitoring it anymore. So it can fall to the wayside. But yeah, my hope is that people will, see these kind of things and, keep contributing back to it. Which is, one of the major reasons people do open source anyway, is to have community contribution. So
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think a lot of times these really do require that. The Crypto-Lamus group that I referred to earlier, that just has been such a prototype of how things can work, where you have all of these folks that are and one-off contributors that are just releasing signatures and updating detections. And I haven't really seen the same level of effort since then. And maybe that's just due to the nature, I guess, of Emotet being as large as it was. And I don't know if anything quite to that scale has replaced it or will replace it. But, certainly those communities, when they pop up and they thrive, they can just be so powerful. So, yeah. And Cobalt Strike has a large footprint, both, as you said, both legitimate and unfortunately a little bit of illegitimate. So, well, Greg, I think we've talked for a good solid hour now. I think at this point, it's usually a good time to start wrapping things up. Let's see. Anything you want to cover before we do that?
No, I think I've rambled on a good bit here. I appreciate the opportunity to do it.
Okay, that sounds great. Okay, well, thanks again, Greg, and thanks everyone for tuning in.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
All right, take care. And that's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Greg Sinclair. If so, please take a moment to subscribe, rate, and share our podcast with a friend. It really helps us bring you more incredible stories like this one.